This meeting of the Margate Planning Board is called to order. Please stand for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This meeting is being held in accordance with due public notice thereof and pursuant to the New Jersey State Sunshine Law. Notice of this meeting was advertised in the press, and a copy of same has been posted on the bulletin board in the municipal building. All applicants are hereby advised that should you receive board approval tonight, you must come forward and sign a form which informs you regarding the timing of receiving building permits and mercantile licenses. At the end of your case tonight, please see the board administrator to sign the two information sheets.
Tom Collins.
Here.
Clem Wozleski. Rich Patterson.
Here.
Mike Cristaldi.
Here.
Jim Galantino.
Here.
Margaret Gubernalti.
Here.
Craig Palmisano.
Here.
Despina Hess. Remy Pelosi. Joe DiGirolamo.
Here.
Ron Grupo.
Here.
Mike Richmond.
Here.
Sorry. I'd like to hear a motion to approve the minutes of April 25th, 2019.
I'll make that motion. I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. I'd like to hear a motion for the approval of decisions and resolutions. Number 19, 2019, Darren and Jamie Morgan. Number 20, 2019, Scott Mertz.
I'll make it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. Motion passes. First case is Alan and Linda Shubin, 23 South Union Avenue, Block 121, Lot 9, in the S40 district to grant a C variance relief for left side yard setback, right side yard setback, combined side yard setback, and possibly others. Taxes and water are current, and proof of advertising and notifying is satisfied. Mr. McLarnon, would you be sworn in, please?
Sure, and just real quick before we get there, Mr. Goldstein, did you want to say something about the Sumner Avenue application real quick?
I did, Mr. Manos, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, there is an application for 10 North Sumner. With the board's permission, that application we would request be carried until the June meeting and request that no additional notices be sent out or publication. Roger and I are going to discuss some of the variances, and Bob Lolio and I are going to go back and maybe make a couple changes. So we thought it might be better to take a breath and have that one heard a month from now.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, and then I just have to make a formal announcement. June, next meeting, sorry.
28th, I believe.
I think it's 28.
What? 10 North Sumner. This is 23 South Union.
June 27th.
June 27th. So if anyone's here for the application of Larry and Clara Schreiber, that's 10 North Sumner, Block 220, Lot 12. That's going to be heard June 27th, 2019. June 27th, 2019, 6:30 p.m. in this room. Applicant will not be required to re-advertise or re-notice. That said, Mr. McLarnon, do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but
I
the truth?
do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board Chairman, board members. Our report is based on the application of Alan and Linda Shubin, 23 South Union Avenue, Block 121, Lot 9, within the S40 zone. Incomplete. Substantial benefit variance. The background is as follows. The applicant is seeking relief from the ordinances of the City of Margate to add a second-floor addition to an existing 1.5-story single-family dwelling to create a full 2-story dwelling with existing nonconformities. The site is located within the S40 zone and is adjacent to the S60 zone. Variances required are listed below. The garage is counted as building coverage as it is connected to the principal structure. The structure is also below BFE plus freeboard requirements and is subject to the 50% improvement requirements of the flood damage prevention ordinance. Page 2 is a zoning chart. Continued on page 3, along with the documents reviewed, the variances required are as follows. Side yard setback for the building, whereas 5 feet is a required minimum side yard setback, 2.8 feet exists and 2.8 feet is proposed. This is a expansion of a non-conforming setback. That's a vertical expansion, as per Schedule B1. Combined side yard setback for the building not counting the garage, whereas 17.4 feet is required minimum combined side yard setback. 12.2 feet exists, and 12.2 feet is proposed. Again, it's an expansion of a non-conforming combined side yard setback. I have an asterisk next to the third one, which is combined side yard setback for the building counting the garage. I just want verification from Terry that they are connected physically.
They touch each other, but there is no way to get into
There's
the
no
garage
shared
of the
wall?
house. They share a tiny little corner, but they do touch.
All right. Splitting hairs now, aren't we? So I would say that the 2 variances are required, the 2 that I just read. If they're not sharing a wall, they're not sharing a roof. So the combined side yard setback is 12.2 as opposed to the 2.8 feet. The waivers requested are as follows. The variance checklist item 1A, copy of an area map showing all lot lines within 200 feet of the property. My comments, I'm not going to read every comment, but the waiver request can be granted without any detriment. The side yard setback on the left side does not meet the minimum required of 5 feet, and expansion of the same setback requires a variance. The combined side yard setback does not meet the minimum required of 17.4 feet, and again, it's an expansion of the same setback deficit requires a variance. The ground cover is highly impervious, and although the proposed expansion does not affect the landscaping, there is a requirement in the ordinance to comply with landscaping such as shrubs and trees, and I believe that Terry shows those on the plan. However, the trees are required to be in a planting strip. Landscape needs to be clarified, including correct number of shrubs for each front and the total. Terry will address that. The limit of the public improvements need to be clearly shown, if there's going to be any. Existing outside shower is non-conforming, but it's already pre-existing non-conforming. The second floor addition could have a setback of 5 feet to meet the minimum required, but would also require a combined side yard setback variance. Terry just verified comment number 10 about the garage and the building and its proximity. The recommendations are listed in a report for the C2 criteria that they have to demonstrate variances and the variances. That pretty much completes my report at this time.
Roger, can I ask you about number 8? They didn't have a permit for the shower? I'm not sure what you're saying there.
I couldn't find a permit for existing shower, but it's existing non-conforming. It looks like it's been there for a while. So
Okay.
I'm not too worried about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Olsen on behalf of the applicant, Alan and Linda Shubin. Just by way of background regarding the property, as Roger indicated, the work that's being done is not going to expand the existing nonconformities outside of the footprint. There will be a vertical expansion, but the nonconformities that exist now will exist when the proposed work is done. The Shubins purchased this property almost a year to the day after Sandy. They had determined early on that they might want to tear it down, they might want to do something different than what they're doing now. It sat for a while, and ultimately they decided that it would be in their best interest and the neighbor's best interest to just do a smaller renovation than to tear it down and start from scratch. This isn't a project they intend on selling, it's not a spec house. Their goal here is to give themselves just a little bit more room. They've got grown children, they anticipate at some point hopefully having grandchildren, and it's just really to make a little more room at the property than is there now. With me tonight, Terry Cummings, a licensed New Jersey architect. I would ask, once she gets sworn in, that the board accept her qualifications so she can testify as an expert in the field of architecture. If she's okay to be sworn in now, Mr. Manos, I'd like her to walk us through the project.
Sure, and if you could just state your name and business address, and I'll swear you in.
Terry J. Cummings, 102 Arbor Court, Linwood, New Jersey.
And do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Terry, you've been before this board on many occasions and many boards throughout the state. You're a licensed architect in the state of New Jersey, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, we accept the
Patterson, thank
credentials.
you. Okay. Terry, if you could walk us through the project, the goals being the Shubin's attempt to minimize the construction on the neighborhood, and also the fact that hopefully, when this is done, the house doesn't look too much different than it looks now.
Good evening, everyone. The goal of this project was to keep the house and how it sits with its neighbors as close as possible to what it is today. I have a picture, it's a little larger than the one in your packet, of the house as it is today, and this is what we're talking about. And if you can see from my sketch, right here, the difference is, can you hold that? Thank you. Yeah, the difference is absolutely minimal, and that was intentional. Right now, we are not changing the first floor of the house at all. It's fine the way it is, but upstairs, the second floor is under the roof line. So there's lots of sloping roofs, lots of dead corners, a lot of wasted space. There are 4 tiny bedrooms up there right now, and they're just barely closet space. So the intent was to make better use of the space without infringing any more than we already do on this site.
Now, Terry, I'm just going to stop you real quickly, because I'm sure the board will have this question. This house is lower than it needs to be based upon the current base flood, correct?
It is.
And at some point, assuming the board grants this, Schubins are going to go and apply for a building permit to Mr. Galantino, and they're going to have to comply with the city's 50% rule, correct?
Yes, and we're prepared for that.
Okay, just want to make sure that we're aware of that. Okay, I'm sorry.
So you'll be under or you'll be over?
Under.
Okay.
Be under. So right now, just to walk you down through the variances that we're looking for. Right now, our lot area does not need a zoning variance, though the lot width is already slightly undersized, but that can't be changed. We are actually, on the first floor, we are slightly over the allowable lot coverage. But again, we're not touching the first floor, and it's situated as it is, where we're have the driveway on the top, and where our real issue is down here, where we have slightly less than 3 feet of side yard space.
And you're referring in that regard to the right side yard setback, correct?
The left side, front here.
The left side, I'm sorry.
The left side, yes. So this is, yes, the footprint does not change at all, and the first floor does not change at all. The front deck does not change at all, except when we get to the second story, where we're actually pulling the front deck back away from the street a little bit. And you can see here the question that Roger had. This is the tiny little area where the garage touches the house. It is fairly insignificant. However, we did go back and include that lot coverage in the chart that you're looking at now. So that lot coverage, building coverage of 1,742 square feet actually does include that garage. So we are asking for a variance simply so that the new structure can sit right on top of the existing structure. We're literally pulling off the roof, rebuilding a second floor, and then putting a roof right back on top again. It's very straightforward, it's very simple, and it blends right back in the neighborhood the way this house does.
Mr. McClellan referenced in his report, Mr. Patterson questioned the outdoor shower. It's your understanding that when the Schubins purchased this from the Spike estate, that the outdoor shower was already there, correct?
To my understanding, yes. And it is, you can see it right here. It's here up against the garage and just in this little corner. It's just a surround, just a vinyl surround. So just to show, what we're doing on the second floor is the stairs stay exactly as they are from the first floor, and we come up. It's simply a new layout, the same amount of rooms they had before. We're able to add an extra bathroom, so the 3 bedrooms get to share 2 bathrooms instead of just 1. The master suite stays a similar size, and there's a little nook for watching television, which was the big request that they don't have now, is enough living space for everyone. And that is the simple plan. We actually brought back the deck a little bit. It was sticking 2 feet further out. We've lined it up so it's straight. And there were no other changes to the house. One other thing that we have done. Because we are so close to the property line, under our 2'10" out, we've set the house in at one area, just 6 inches, so that we can get our glazing in there and still meet the fire codes and safety codes that allow us to do this. So we've taken that into account as well.
Terry, based upon your examination of the neighborhood and based on this design of the house, do you see any detriments associated with the variances we're seeking?
No, I think this fits into the neighborhood just exactly as the existing house does today.
The extent that
Eric,
you were-
microphone, please.
And to the extent, Terry, that you were to weigh the benefits versus the detriments, the benefits of your design would clearly outweigh the detriments, is that correct?
I don't see any detriments to the design, and the benefits to the homeowner, I think, fit their needs very well.
Unless the board has any questions further from Ms. Cummings, we would rest based upon the application, subject to board wanting to make comments, et cetera.
Based on that testimony, I recommend that the side yard setback variance for the combined side yard reference the garage at 2.8 feet versus
Sure.
not including the garage. Include it in the building coverage anyway.
Since it is a technical variance, as Mr. McLaurin pointed out, we're also going to be seeking, Terry, the variance for the garage. Since it's attached, the building coverage would be affected. So with regard to the garage itself, do you see any detriment associated with the construction, even though the garage isn't being touched, and that additional variance being granted?
Eric, since the expansion is not more than 50%, why don't we make the structure flood compliant with some flood vents? Maybe 7 of them that will be compliant?
I don't see a problem with that, it's fine.
Is it a grass strip out front now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Roger commented he wanted grass out there. I didn't know if there already was.
The Shubins tried to be proactive years ago when they bought it to keep as much grass as possible. Obviously, they were constrained by the site, which, the house hasn't changed much since they bought it, other than some exterior touches on it.
A very nice landscaping in the front, as you can see from the photograph that's being passed around. And even if we lose some of that during construction, they plan on putting all that back to the same level.
Board have any other questions?
Where do they put the trash and recycles?
Trash and recycling.
I believe right now it's all in the backyard, or actually probably somewhat in the garage.
Is there an access to the garage?
Yes,
Not from the house. I'm sorry.
Yeah, not from the house. From the backyard, there was a door and the overhead door in the front from the driveway.
That doesn't show on the drawings. Why I ask?
Terry, what is, did you consider raising the
Microphone.
house?
They did consider raising it, and I think, Mr. Richmond, the choice really became, leave it like it is now to the second floor, or just demolish it altogether. The raise, they don't really need the room on the ground level, and if they were going to do the raise, it would probably serve them better to just demolish. This is about the least obstructive thing to do at the property, in their opinion.
And another comment to that is, notice we are only doing a two-story home, the existing first floor, and we are adding only 1 story. So this house is going to stay a 2-story home. There's never going to be a 3rd floor added. Certainly, if they went the other way and had to tear it down, more than likely you would end up with a 2.5-story home in the same spot. This gives it just a 2-story home.
Anything else from the board?
So you basically need that sidewalk on the narrow side of the property to remain for rear access.
Correct.
I'd like to open it for public comment. If anyone is here from the public who would have any questions or would like to comment, please come forward and be sworn in. Public portion is closed. Board have any further comments? Leo, would you read the motion, please? Sure.
And Mr. Goldstein, you're okay with everything in Mr. McLaren's report?
Correct.
And Roger, you said we're gonna count the garage towards the side yard, the combined side yard setback.
Correct.
All right, so someone needs to make a motion for C variance relief for the following: side yard setback to the building of 2.8 feet where 5 feet required, that's on the left side. And then a combined side yard setback to the building, which includes the garage, of 2.8 feet or 17.4 feet required. There's also a waiver for the submission of an area map showing all properties within 200 feet. The conditions will be, the applicant will provide for the required number of flood vents, which Mr. Galantino estimated to be 7. And the applicant will comply with all other conditions in Mr. McLaren's report dated May 24th, and the applicant will comply with any representations it made during the course of the hearing.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
Tom Collins?
Actually, Terry, you did a very nice job on this. I like the way you designed it, and I like the fact that we're not expanding the footprint and keeping the overall mass of the structure low, which is positive for the neighborhood. I see no negative impacts on the neighborhood. I think aesthetically it's going to be an improvement. And as everything that we're doing in Margate, every time we do a house like this, values just keep going up. Neighborhoods are happy, residents are happy, and the board's happy. So I vote in favor.
Clem Wazleski?
Two very positive things about this that we don't see enough of. A, there's a decent house that they're not tearing down. And B, it's 2 stories instead of 2.5, which actually turns out to be 3.5. Yeah, I vote to approve.
Rich Patterson?
Terry, I also think you did a good job in keeping it to a minimum. I approve the application basically for what Mr. Collins said.
Mike Cristaldi?
I'm in agreement with the other board members. It's a really nice design on the property. I'm really surprised that the neighbors didn't show up, but them not being here, I definitely approve this.
Jim Galantino?
As you know, the improvement value of the structure itself was probably around 600,000, so 50% of 600,000 would be 300,000. You know you were not going to exceed that number, so it's kind of hard to get you on the 50%. I would love to see you elevate, but my hands are tied on the FEMA rule. Seeing that, and it was already an existing second floor, so it's not a substantial improvement. As to that, I see no problem with granting the variance, yes.
Margaret Gubernalty?
I agree with the other board members as well. Really nice plan, improvement for keeping. It is the least obstructive improvement. I like the fact that it's a 2-story dwelling, and I think the application will love.
Mike Richmond?
Yeah, I really don't see any detriment to the neighborhood, so I'm going to approve it.
The application passes 7-0.
Thank you.
Next case is Bendel LLC, 11 South Madison Avenue, Block 129, Lot 211, in the multifamily district to grant C relief for lot size, building coverage, combined side yard setback, and possibly others. Taxes and water are current, and proof of advertising and notifying is satisfied. Mr. McLarnin?
Thank you, Board Chairman, board members. My report is based on Bendo LLC, 11 South Madison Avenue, Block 129, Lot 211, within the MF zone. The background is as follows. The applicant is seeking relief from the ordinances of the City of Margate in order to construct a new flood-compliant 2-family dwelling. The variance is being requested for items addressed below. The existing structure is to be raised. The site is located within the MF zone or multifamily zone. The proposed 2-family and therefore TF zoning rules apply as per Schedule B1. So the zoning chart is on sheet 2, and where I contrast the TF requirements versus the required MF requirements. And other than lot area, you refer to the TF requirements as per the ordinance. Page 3 includes the documents reviewed, and the variance is required as follows. Combined side yard setbacks. Whereas the minimum combined side yard setback for the TF residential zone is 13.9 feet, and the proposed minimum combined side yard setback is 12.5 feet. The second variance being requested is building coverage, whereas the maximum building coverage for the TF zone is 32% and 38% is proposed. 45% is the maximum building coverage allowed in the MF zone if 3 more units were to be constructed, but the property does not meet the density requirements to permit 3 units. So therefore, the 32% governs. Waiver is requested similar to the last case where the variance checklist item 1A, copy of an area map showing all lot lines within 200 feet of the property has been requested. Comments, I'll highlight the important ones. The waiver requested can be granted without any detriment. Submit a sign and seal front yard setback survey with the date of that survey. The area is within the MF zoning district, but the proposal mostly resembles a TF use based on use. The minimum side yard setback for residential use for the existing lot width is 5 feet. 5 feet is proposed, so variance is not required. Again, going back to the combined side yard setbacks, where it's 37% of the lot width, which calculates 13.9 feet, and 12.75 feet is proposed, requiring a variance. Building coverage, same thing as discussed before. The front yard landscaping and total landscaping requirements appear to be met. A planting strip is shown to contain 2 trees, which is in compliance with the master plan and the zoning ordinance. A grass strip between its tire strips is proposed, and since the overall landscape coverage is being met, I would suggest eliminating these grass strips as they have a tendency to disappear after they get their CO. The applicant shall provide proposed grades for the public right-of-way for the sidewalk, the curbing, and the driveway. Sidewalk should not exceed 2% cross slope. No easements are shown on the property. Total shrub count should be 30, with at least half within the front yard setback. Some recommendations, besides the usual, is lot grading shall be from the rear of the property to the front towards the street. Street opening permits will be required. Location of utilities should be shown on the plans. Water valves and sewer cleanout should not be located in the driveway or public sidewalk. And that concludes my report.
Mr. Collins has recused himself. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Goldstein on behalf of the applicant, Bendel LLC. With me this evening is Brett Fisher, the sole principal of Bendel LLC, along with Peter Weiss, his expert, who has prepared the plans, the architectural plans for this duplex. As Mr. McLaren points out, this project is very interesting because you've got a lot where landscape coverage, which I know is such a big deal in town, isn't just met, it's actually greatly exceeded. And Brett and Pete really sat down and noodled on this, how to get as much landscaping as possible here. So before we get into the meat of it, front yard landscaping is over, total landscaping is over. We're bound by the constraints of the property, but overall, this is kind of what Brett does. He builds these duplexes, and I think he also does a very good job in doing so. The look of these projects, you can see them all throughout town. It's a classic Margate-type duplex with parking underneath, and this one really is no exception. Brett has actually partnered up with the existing property owner, which is an LLC that is controlled by Mr. Joe Simango, who's here as well, although Joe's not the applicant. They're doing this in tandem for the 2 units to be built, one of which will probably be lived in, one of which will most likely be sold. So the goal is to make this duplex kind of match the other duplexes that Brett has built throughout town, which I think everyone will acknowledge. They just look great, and they're a testament to, many of them have come before the board, to the board's ideals on what these properties should be developed as. So that having said, Pete is the designer of all these properties, so why don't you stand up and get sworn, and we'll talk about how great your design is and what the variances we need on this one are. So Terry left the microphone there.
Sure, Mr. Weiss, just your name and business address.
Peter Weiss, 101 North Washington Avenue, Margate.
And you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Weiss, we know you're an architect licensed in the state of New Jersey, and you've appeared before this board on many occasions. Mr. Patterson, may you please accept Mr. Weiss as an expert in the field?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Pete, if you don't mind walking us through the plan, discuss the variances, obviously, but also the way this project lays out on the lot and how we can perhaps get the variances to build another duplex which will beautify the neighborhood.
Okay, so, excuse me, the existing lot is slightly undersized because it's 37.5 feet wide, where 40 foot is required as the minimum. However, the areas far exceeds what's required for a duplex because it's deep, 125 foot deep. There's an existing 2-story house on the lot that'll be demolished. So what we're proposing is a duplex with flats, meaning there's 1 unit on each floor for above parking and storage. So there's 2 parking spaces inside and 2 in front of the building front of the garage. This neighborhood, if you've driven up the street, it's kind of a mixed bag of single-family duplexes and multifamily. So to that extent, it pretty much fits in the neighborhood. There hasn't been a lot of improvement on this particular street. There's a couple newer buildings, but the rest of it is older buildings.
Pete, if you don't mind, something that's also important is this is kind of substantially below the height requirement that you could have gone up until. Brett and his partners decided to keep it a little lower. Let's talk about that for a second, if you don't mind.
Correct. So we're, even though we have 9-foot ceilings on each unit, on each floor, we're still going to be more than 4 foot below the permitted height restriction.
So this isn't a typical example where you're trying to max everything out, correct?
Correct. So we're looking for seeking variances for combined yard setbacks. So I would just point out that the minimum setback on each side would be 5 feet. We're over 6 foot on each side, so the building's basically centered on the lot, and we've got 6.2 on one side and 6.3 or 4 on the other side. That makes the building 25 feet wide, which is kind of a good number for fitting bedrooms and you know, getting decent-sized rooms in the units. Now, this is kind of driven by, of course, the combined side yard setback is somewhat driven by the lot being 200 feet smaller than required.
Okay. Based upon your design, do you see any negatives or detriments associated if the board were to grant these variances?
No.
And to the extent that you were to weigh the positives against the negatives, would you say that the positives greatly outweigh any negatives that could be associated with the project?
Yes.
If the board has any further questions, wants to discuss it any further.
Would you tell us some positives, please?
Well, you're getting a new building for one thing. Of course, it's going to be flood compliant because it's elevated.
And is the building there now flood compliant?
No.
You're staying below the height, you've got light, air, open space that you're maintaining, which could be different with regard to the 4 feet that you're cutting out of the building, correct?
Yes.
Would you consider that to be a positive?
Yes.
How many bedrooms are in the current house?
The current house, I don't know. 4 or 5. So these units have 4 bedrooms each, which is how we arrived at 2 parking spaces per unit. So I don't think these, I mean, the units are about 1,800 square feet each, which is, you know, not a big unit. It's a comfortable size.
Pete, the air compressors on the side, I see them, they look like they're at elevation 13 or 12. Can we get them up to 14 somehow? Is that going to affect that window, the 2092 window in that niche?
That's fine, Mr. Galantino. Mr. Ben,
They could be raised, yeah.
Mr. Fisher said that's not going to be a problem. Yeah, that's good.
It's not an egress window.
You're demoing the existing building,
Correct.
so you'll have a vacant lot.
At some point, it'll be vacant.
Why couldn't you have designed the building to meet the coverage?
Well, I think, understandably, it could have been designed, and then I'd be disingenuous if I said it couldn't be designed to meet that. But the goal is to have as much rear yard, front yard, without pushing the building around. We'd be, I think, having a tougher time if we met the coverage with regard to other aspects. That's why Pete kept it a little lower. That's why we're still way over on landscaping. I would say that that's a trade-off for the variances to try to get as much green space at the property as possible.
If you have less coverage, you get more green space.
That's correct as well.
There's a lot of green space there now. And, in this zone, it's a multifamily zone, so, for a somewhat different project, you could go up to 45% building coverage, so we're kind of splitting the baby here between,
If you're with the 45%,
if it was,
in a different zone.
no, in this zone, if it was a multifamily building, if it was a triplex, you could go 45%.
So would a triplex need no variances?
No, triplex, the lot's too small for a triplex. But I'm just saying.
How much is it over, like, square foot wise on coverage?
About 280 square feet.
I think that, you know, if you were to reduce it that much, it would substantially impact the building, the units. I mean, it probably-
So if you reduced it that much, you could put a nice single-family there, but not a duplex.
Well, you could put a duplex, it would just be smaller. You could put a single
Right.
family there, it would just be a different type of design
Right.
in that zone, correct? And we always have this discussion. Of course, as Mr. Roslewski points out, on a vacant lot, you can do just about anything. You could always design compliant homes, and, you know, there's definitely no disputing that argument. But I think based on Pete's design and the overall development along this block, this is a pretty significant benefit without detriments, as Pete testified.
Well, the detriment would be more people and more cars.
But there'd be the same number of people and same number of cars if it were compliant.
No, single-family home, 3 bedrooms, 3
No,
cars,
If it was a compliant duplex, it'd be the same number of
a
bedrooms.
duplex as opposed to a single home.
But it's in an MF zone, there's no,
I
we're
know
not
it's,
asking
I know
for-
it's MF
yeah.
zone, but there are a lot of single homes on that block, right next door, across the street, there's a single home. There's
But
another one
respectfully,
that's,
we have
another
to-
one, two houses away, that's huge, single home.
and that may be, but we're allowed to build a duplex here, so the same number.
Yeah, it is the zone,
Yeah.
yes, it is a zone to have a duplex.
Well, you can't build a triplex that's too small, and you're not allowed to build a duplex this big. That's why you're here, so,
Right.
right.
But there's no requirement to build a single. We're not
No,
asking.
no, we're not saying that. But you do have too much coverage for a duplex, so there's an argument for a single.
Understood.
Anything else?
Is this going to be condo, Eric? Or
Yes.
Any swimming pools proposed?
No.
in the back? You're going to swale the side yard so it maintains drainage on the property?
Absolutely.
Is the, I should know this answer. Are the decks
Speak into
considered,
the mic. Turn the
are the
mic.
decks considered coverage, Roger, or is it just the principal structure?
Principal structure.
Okay,
It's lot coverage,
right.
not building coverage.
Are you done, Eric? I'm sorry. Go.
Perhaps.
No, that's okay, go ahead.
I believe we're completed, Mr. Patterson.
Anything else from the board, Jim?
One more thing. We know we need those non-conversion agreements.
Always in advance, Mr. Galantino.
Anything else? Anyone here from the public like to comment? Please come forward and be sworn in.
Good evening, Brian Callahan of law firm Callahan Thompson Thompson on behalf of Art Roth, who's the next door neighbor. Mr. Roth has, at the current time, a
Which side? Facing the house?
bay,
Right side.
ocean, well, bay for him,
Bay side, okay, got it.
ocean side,
Ocean
ocean
side.
side. We currently have a shared driveway, not via easement, but via how it's been operating for the last 40 years. And Mr. Roth has spoken with the owners to indicate that during demolition, if this is approved and during construction, that he would still have access to the rear yard to park his cars, as the parties have been doing for the last 40 years. and the applicant has indicated that that is acceptable to him. So we just wanted to place that on the record to say that during that period of time. Mr. Roth also may be applying to the city because we have a planter in that area of our side yard right now, and that planter may be getting removed so that when the projects are all done, that he has his own 10 feet and they have their own side yard, so that the concept of having to drive over each property to get to the back is eliminated. So we just want to place that on the record.
Thank you.
Very much.
Mr. Callahan's correct. The parties have spoken among themselves. They're going to maintain good neighborly relations and allow the ingress and egress while the construction's going. And I believe Brett might even have his contractors offer some work to the neighbors at their expense, of course, but to just save some money while his guys are out, he would help them with their project.
Okay. Anyone else in the public have any comments? Public portion is closed. Any other comments, questions from the board? Would you read the motion, please?
Sure. Mr. Galantino, you wanted the HVAC units to elevation 14, is that? Okay. That said, someone needs to make a motion for C variance relief for the following: a combined side yard setback of 13.9 feet, where 12.5 feet is permitted, building coverage of 38%, where 32% is the permitted maximum. There's also a waiver from the submission of that area map with all properties within 200 feet. The conditions will be the HVAC units on the side will be raised to elevation 11. The applicant will provide for the non-conversion agreement for the space below BFE, and the applicant will comply with Mr. Callahan's request that that shared driveway to the neighboring property on the ocean side be preserved to allow egress and ingress. And all other conditions in Mr. McLaurin's report of May 28, 2019, and the applicant will comply with any representations made on its behalf during the course of the hearing.
Your motion?
I'll make a motion. Anybody second? I'll second.
Clem Wozleski,
Well, I have no doubt this would build, might be an improvement to the property, which is pretty run down. If it met the coverage, I'd probably be in favor of it. However, as presented, it's just too big for the lot. And I have heard no valid reasons to justify a variance for that problem. So I vote no on the application.
Rich Patterson,
Well, this lot's in the multifamily zone, and like I said before, I guess it's not enough room for a triplex. So they want a two-family zone here, but they don't even meet the coverage for the two-family zone. When I look at what's happening, Mr. Palmisano brought it up, we're replacing 4 bedrooms with 8 bedrooms on a small lot. There's parking problems down there, and every square inch of Margate is trying to be built upon. I think it'd be an improvement to the neighborhood to build this, but I think the house is not worthy of staying there. Something's going to replace it, so I don't think that's a concern. Not meeting these requirements, I have to vote no on the application.
Mike Cristaldi,
Non-compliant to compliant. We're going from non-compliant to compliant. We've got no neighbors complaining. It's a multifamily zone. We're 6% off on coverage, which is, you don't even get that in the bank. I'm going to vote to approve because of the neighborhood being so mixed up now and no neighbors complaining. I vote yes.
Jim Galantino,
You guys know me, guys. I mean, that property there has 2 claims on it as a repetitive loss. So to me, that's getting rid of one of our negatives. It goes, we get, a couple extra points. So, and that's our CRS. As to the all physical property itself, it just fits in with the rest of the Margate, that section of the President Street. And like Mike said, 6%, that's not a lot. And it's only .14 on the side yard, right? I agree with Mike. I vote yes.
Margaret Gubernalty?
In that this is an oversized lot, the area does exceed the requirements. I certainly think it's an improvement to the neighborhood. I understand the concerns of maxing out the bedrooms, but I like that Peter certainly didn't max everything out that he could have in terms of height. We're getting a flood compliant property. I think we're maintaining our light, air, and open space. I don't see that many detriments. The 6% is minimal, and I vote in favor of the application.
Craig Palmisano?
I agree, that's a nice design, but I'm not one for jamming in more housing on a specific size lot. It's just not me. I don't go for that anymore. It's just driving down from Atlantic Avenue this past weekend to Monmouth to Amherst Avenue is impossible. We have too many vehicles, too many lines up and down on both sides of the streets, and we want to put 8 more cars in that spot instead of 4. I think each bedroom brings a car. I see it across from my house. I see it on the streets. It's just too much. And you don't meet the requirements for the 40-foot. I think a single home, which there's plenty on that street, across the street, next door, I think it would be fine to put a single home there. Because you'd raise it, it'd be flood compliant, and I think that would go there. So I vote no.
Mike Richmond?
It's in the multifamily zone. So I know there's single-family houses still on that street, but they're all pretty low and non-compliant, and eventually they're going to get raised or demolished or rebuilt. I get the thing about the cars, but if you build a single-family home, you could build 6 bedrooms or 7 bedrooms. So I don't really see that's a valid point to deny an application. It is 6% over the coverage, but it's in a multifamily zone. And if this was in a single-family zone, I might feel differently about it. But that part of town, that's how they roll there. So I'm going to vote yes.
Application passes 4-3.
Next case is James Clerkin, 8805 Fulton Avenue, Block 718, Lot 1.02, in the S40 District. Appeal of Administrative Officer's decision of Margate City Ordinance Number 175-33:D, 3C1, deck elevation. Mr. McLarnin?
I have nothing to say.
All right, Tom's back.
Tom Collins is back.
Let me at least try and give some background on this. Mr. Stein is the attorney for the applicant on behalf of Mr. Clerkin. He has filed an application essentially seeking 2 things. Number 1, he's appealing a decision from Mr. McLarnin, which granted permits for a rear deck. The land use law says appeals from decisions of the administrative officer, which in our ordinances is the zoning officer, who is Mr. McLarnin, have to be brought within 20 days from the date of the decision, and that period runs from when the applicant or the appellant or the person complaining knew or should have known of the decision being appealed from. The way I read the case law is that the board really has no discretion outside that 20 days to act on an appeal. I believe we're going to hear some testimony from Mr. Stein, and we'll let anyone else who wants to speak. The first thing I believe what we should do is address that issue, whether he can introduce his application, will allow Mr. Stein to make any arguments he wishes on the 20-minute issue. If there's any neighbors here, we'll let them speak to that. I keep calling it the 20-minute issue. That's something in criminal law.
That's a DUI.
On the 20-day issue, and then we'll proceed from there. At some point, someone will either make a motion to dismiss the appeal as untimely or proceed with the appeal as timely. And if that passes on the 20-day rule, then I think we should get to the merits of the application. And it's been suggested on the appeal aspect that, well, even if you think it's untimely, you should hear everything and you should still determine whether you think Mr. McCarnan was right or wrong. I don't believe that's the proper way to do things, and the reason is, if you hear everything and you determine that Mr. McCarnan acted appropriately, well, then I guess not much really changes. The permit is still valid. But if you determine the other way, that what he did was improper, then it's my position that what we just did has no force and effect if it's after that 20-day time period. So that's part of my thought process on that. Again, I want to create initially as full a record as we can on this 20-day thing. Now, Mr. Stein, in a letter addressed to the board and myself, suggested, well, I'm also requesting an interpretation because my client lives next door to this property where he's complaining about the height of the rear yard deck. And I want an interpretation that if I want to raise my house, I want to know how high my rear deck can be. Or if I want to demolish my house and build a new one, I want to know how high my rear yard deck can be. Interpretations do not seem to have any time limitation, which sort of makes sense. There is some cases that suggest, well, you can't defeat the 20-day time limitation. There's a case that makes that clear, that you can't, from the appellate court, that you can't defeat the 20-day time limitation by couching it as an interpretation. But if the applicant, Mr. Clearkin, is saying with a straight face, that's not what I want to do, aside from the appeal, I want to know what I can do with my property, well, I don't have a problem with an interpretation on that issue. But that interpretation is, what can he do with the ordinance in effect as we sit here today? We can't give someone an interpretation as if I made an application a year ago, or if I make an application in 12 months. What we might say on an interpretation today might be different in a week from now, and it might have been different last week. So with that said, the first thing I want to address is and you can introduce your application, and then I want to create a record on the time period.
I understand. We're not running into the ordinary, Mr. Manis.
I have one question, Leo, before we get into the case. There's three things involved. There's Roger's interpretation, there's a floodplain, the certified floodplain manager's interpretation, and there's also the construction official interpretation on the building permit application. Because we stamp it, we give the permit. Roger gave it approval. He gave it approval for the height of the deck, but the deck was built with my inspection and my approval. So where did you divide that pie as to the sense of the case?
I think where I divide it is as a combined board, in this instance acting as a zoning board. If we had two separate boards, this is a zoning board application. It says any person aggrieved, and I'm paraphrasing, by a decision from the administrative officer may appeal that decision to the zoning board within 20 days. The administrative officer is defined by ordinance as the zoning officer. The zoning officer is Mr. McLaren. So anything that you may have done, you know, as some other official, wouldn't come to the zoning board.
Mr. Manos, though, and I thank Mr. Galantino for bringing that up, because had he not, I would have. He was part and parcel, although he is not technically the person I'm taking appeal from, but he was part and parcel. So I would indicate, how do you sit there after you've been the one that helped decide and then decide? And I don't think you can.
And I'm glad he asked the question, and I think it would be under those circumstances for Mr. Galantino just to not participate in this, because you were involved in some manner. I don't have a problem if there's a public portion, if you feel like you have something to say, but would you mind sitting in the crowd for this one?
In the rest.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Stein?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the board. My name is Mark Stein, I'm the attorney for Mr. Clerkin. I'm sorry. I'm the attorney for Mr. Clerkin. As you heard from Mr. Manos, this isn't the run-of-the-mill ordinary application that you regularly hear. So I'm going to start off by saying I disagree with Mr. Manos what we're appealing from. May the 27th, and I could have my date slightly wrong, Mr. Manos, there was a decision by the administrative officer, the zoning officer, Mr. McLaren, that was relayed to Mr. Clerk, and that's attached this year, and that's attached to the application, whereby there was a determination, a decision outlining basically his opinion and his writing. We're taking an appeal from that. We received it after Mr. Scott Abbott, who was the city solicitor, got it, he reviewed it, and then sent it on to my client. I will tell you that from the time my client got it until I filed the appeal was 10 days, maybe 9 days. I wasn't taking any more chances with any 20 days, 10 days, other days, it didn't matter. So we are appealing from his decision that is in fact attached to each and every body's application. So I don't think that it is exactly correct to say that we're beyond the time, because that was written, the report was written, as I said, very recently. And if you hold on for 1 second, I can give you the exact date, but I'm sure everybody has it. I think we got it. I think it was date stamped March 27th is when we had it, and I appealed April the 8th is my appeal application. So
May I ask a question? Why?
Sure. Yes.
I'll forget if we wait. He made a decision at that point? Or
He
the
gave
decision
there was an opinion.
Pardon me?
There was a written opinion. There was a request.
About a decision that was made?
No, it was a written opinion as to what the measurement for the deck, how the deck is measured. So he made a determination as the zoning official.
Okay.
How the deck was to be measured.
Okay.
We are taking an appeal from that decision. And we have done it well within the 20 days. We've done it within 10 days. So that's where I'm at there. As to the interpretation part of it, I agree with Mr. Manos. The interpretation, you got to decide on today's law, not on 10 years ago's law or what may happen in the future. It's not an end around. We want to know if you get to the first half of it and you say, well, it was interpreted right, okay. Does that mean that that's still the case for Mr. Clarkin as well? And we want an interpretation moving forward, knowing what, in fact, he can do. So we don't end up in a situation whereby, we have this property being interpreted one way and our property being interpreted another way. We want some clarity in regard to that. In addition, I will indicate that Mr. Clerkin came to the realization that this thing was, as you see in the pictures, okay? What it is late in the game, and that's what precipitated the questions to the city, city employees, and that was what created the response by your zoning officer, and that's why we're here for appeal. So we're well within any times or time limitations that are out there. So I disagree, just right up front. There is a written report, a written opinion by your zoning official, and we are taking an appeal from that determination is what it is, and we're taking an appeal from that. There is no doubt about that. That's what I attached to and indicated that's what our appeal is. Now, what that will mean down the line, we can get a lot of disagreement in regard to that, because it comes down to whether it's clear or not clear which decision the board makes, whether or not, if the decision is that we're correct, then was it clear on that? And then if it was, the original permits may not be valid. But we don't get to that point, and I'm not even worried about that point per se, until we hear the appeal that we've requested. Mr. Manos is talking about an appeal that we haven't filed, okay? So I believe, for the purposes of this application, that this board does in fact have jurisdiction for both of those reasons. At this point in time, I have an additional submission, but I'll hold off, I think I'll hold off. And I don't know, well, I'm going to hand it out, and I don't know whether it'll be helpful to the board or not. The board in 2016 apparently heard testimony about the decks and how they were, going to be, how you were going to determine heights and things of that nature. And I don't know. As I came here, I started thinking, well, before I came here, I started thinking how many of the board members were here then to know, what the rationale and what wasn't. So we ordered parts of the transcript. Most of it's Mr. Barnhart's statements. So I have enough. Well, I handed one out, so I'm not sure I have enough anymore. But I'm going to pass these around. Thank you.
Yeah, and we're going to hear everyone on the timeliness issue. We'll let you pass those out, but then let's just get a couple things clear for the record.
Sure.
Your client, because I know there's two Clerkins, is my understanding.
I only know Mr. Clerkin here, that's all.
And is that Joseph Clerkin?
James? Joseph? Oh.
James is my father.
Father, okay. James is the owner of the property, and that's why we put it in his name. Well, co-owner, yes. I have Joseph here, but James is,
Okay.
Jim's-
And
Joe.
And they own the property at
8801.
8801 Fulton.
Yeah. That's immediately adjacent. As you're facing from the street, it would be to the right. If you're on the bay, it would be on the left.
Okay.
You can see the pictures. There's that big wall. I know Donald Trump keeps asking to build a wall. We didn't want this wall built, but that
Good or now?
you can see where it is. It's immediately adjacent to my client's property.
All right. Now, a couple things I just want to get in the record here. Mr. McLarnon issued a zoning permit.
Do I have enough of those?
Is this a legal transcript?
Yes, it's just the transcript is all I gave you.
But who transcribed?
I'll have my client testify as to that. Where'd you get it?
Okay, well,
You're not sworn in.
Okay,
okay,
okay.
we'll wait.
It was a professional transcriber.
It's not signed or sealed.
Okay.
And Mr. Manis, that's what I was asking to be heard about
Okay.
prior to the board members receiving that, but I'll let Mr. Stein finish. I do object to what's been handed out. I don't want that on the record as well.
Okay, objections noted, but let me just say, did Mr. McLarnon, as the zoning officer, issued a zoning permit, which at the time was his signing off of the plans, on or about June 28th of 2018. And those were the plans for the property at 8805 Fulton Avenue. And those are the plans that are the subject of this matter.
And that was the date of the decision.
Right, and So there was an action taken by the by Mr. McLaren back in June 2018. Following that, I just want to get a couple correspondence, and I'll refer to my letter to Mr. Stein of April 22nd, 2019. There's an email from Mr. Clearkin dated July 30th indicating that he reviewed the plans. There's then a correspondence from him, Mr. Clerkin, to the zoning officer dated August 13th, stating in part, quote, it does appear a subdivision and building permit have been issued and work is progressing. There's a correspondence from Mr. Clearkin to the zoning officer dated September 6, 2018, stating that, in part, quote, that he, quote, discovered a subdivision was in fact submitted on 6/22/18, approved 6/25/18, and filed on 7/3/18. There's an email from Mr. Clearkin to Anthony Perrano, who was building the property at 8805 Fulton Avenue. That's dated March 5th, 2019, stating that, quote, it may be a good idea to check the elevation of that rear deck. They have some pretty strict elevation requirements on the Bray front, and that deck looks too high. Then there's an email from Anthony Perrano to Mr. Clerkin dated March 5th, 2019, where Mr. Perrano states he was, quote, building it of the approved plans from the city, and then with that email he provided the plans that show the rear deck in question and its height.
And that was in March of 2019?
That was March 5th, 2019.
Okay.
There's an email from Mr. Clearkin to Mr. Goldstein, who's the attorney for 8805, who we'll hear from next, dated March 8th, 2019, stating that the deck elevation, quote, the deck elevation looked higher than allowed by the Margate Code on Bayfront properties. And then there's an email from Mr. Clearkin to Richard Deeney, Margate's business administrator, dated March 13th, 2019, where he complains about the height of the deck. I'm not quoting that. I'm obviously paraphrasing that. If you take each of those, they are all more than 20 days before he filed the appeal. What Mr. Stein's position is, later, Mr. McLaren issues a memo dated March 13th, 2019, which they testified that they received somewhere thereafter, to Mr. Scott Abbott, who's our city solicitor, where he basically, Mr. McLaren summarizes his position on this matter. So what they're suggesting is that that is when our appeal time starts, where this memorandum is actually what we're appealing from. So I want at least a couple of those things on the record.
And, I'm sorry, Mr. Manos, as you just indicated when you were talking to Mr. Galantino, all those other letters back and forth and memos are extraneous to the issue, because the issue is the zoning officer is the administrative officer as defined by both the statute and your ordinance.
Correct. So the, but the,
Well, you indicated they were more than 20 days, and I'm just suggesting to you that the 20 days doesn't apply to them, as you indicated just previously.
No,
It applies to the zoning officer.
the zoning officer's decision.
Yes.
But what I would suggest that the board might think that those show is clear knowledge of this deck, and that permits were issued for this deck starting back in the summer sometime. That was the purpose of that. Let's, Mr. Goldstein, you want to add anything on this issue, and then we can hear from.
I do want to add a couple of things, and the board.
Do you want them sworn in?
You're speaking on behalf of a client, legal argument on behalf of a client,
That is correct.
and your client is?
Anthony Perrano and Jim Robertson. Mr. Robertson owns the property. Mr. Perrano built the property.
Okay. Then no.
Okay.
You're
So,
making an argument.
a couple of things, ladies and gentlemen. Number one, the board's been given several paragraphs of what appears to be statements at a meeting. That information doesn't appear to be certified at all, and to the extent that board members have read it, I just don't want it to taint their decision, where ultimately they base their determination of what to do on information in front of them that appears to just have been typed up and copied. As Casey points out, if this were presented should be presented correctly, it would be certified by a court reporter or notary. This looks like it's just words. I don't know what those words are, where they came from. I've not read it, and I would ask that the board members not, as it doesn't have any legal weight, in my opinion. It's like prepared by Mr. Clerkin himself. That's like me preparing something that could be incorrect, so.
Mr. Clerkin would be prepared to testify as to its authenticity.
Respectfully, he's not a certified reporter, so it's authentic to him, but it may not be authentic. So I am going to object in that regard. Secondly, placing another objection on the record, the administrative officer's decision, which is Mr. McLarnon, is upon the granting of the zoning stamp on those plans from 18. What we're dealing with is some tortured reading to try to shoehorn their arguments in, because quite frankly, they're just too late. So when you're too late, you jump on anything you can possibly jump on. Well, the fact that Mr. Clerkin was emailing incessantly and Mr. McLarnon responded with what he believed was a good faith explanation, that is not what gets appealed to this board. What gets appealed to this board under the statute 40:55D-72A is the decision of the administrative officer based on enforcement of the zoning ordinance. That decision is when the plans get stamped. The fact that Mr. McLarnon just happened to write an email does not restart the clock, because under that argument, anytime anybody at City Hall had a communication with somebody, it would restart the clock. And Mr. Manos, and I'm sure Mr. Stein are both aware, the leading cases on this, Sitkowski and O'Hara, say that. You have a time within which to make your appeal. That time is not extended because someone cleverly goes in to City Hall, asks a question, gets an answer and says, aha, now I've got my time started again. That ain't how it works. So I do, and we'll let Mr. Stein continue with his case, but my objections have to do with the procedural aspect. If the board decides to have the case go forward over my objection, I assume it'll be Mr. McLarnon's objection, we'll get to the substantive aspect of whether the permits were granted correctly. My client obtained the permits based on the then existing ordinance, and the house was built based on the then existing ordinance. The house is done and has a CO. They're not modifying the house. But I object to the very issue of this time, because the time doesn't start again. We're bound by the date that Mr. Clerkin knew or should have known, and at worst, it's summer of 18. At best, it's March of 19. He's out of time no matter what. And I think this is just a desperate attempt to try to get the board to make a decision to somehow benefit him for a plan he wants to put into place going forward on some construction project that's not yet before the board. And I would also say, I'm not even sure the board has jurisdiction to give an advisory opinion on what he can do in the future, because you're not presented with plans. So it would be conceptually kind of odd that you would say, this is what you can do if you brought us plans.
All right, can we get to that? We're still in the
Right.
20-day thing.
So, under
We'll
the
get to
20
that
days-
if we get that far.
I just think the statute is strictly enforced. Statute is 20 days from the date knew or should have known. Knew or should have known is as early as summer of last year. Cases all say the same thing. I'll let Mr. Stein present his procedural aspect of the case. But again, Mr. Manos, I would ask that the info you've been given not be reviewed, because that could taint the board's final decision. And I guess we'll have time to go back and forth as Mr. Stein completes his.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'll say this about the transcript. He passed it out. We're not on the merits. So at least at this point, I would instruct the board, unless and until we get by this 20-day time period, don't focus on this. And then we'll deal with that if we get to
I'm
the
sorry,
merits.
Mr. Chair, go ahead.
You guys are lawyers. Most of us aren't lawyers. Some of us are, but I still don't get your point, and I want to get your point. I'm trying to see it from your viewpoint.
Okay.
What if we said we agree with your appeal to this memorandum? What has that got to do with the case of a year ago? This is meaningless. I mean, to me, I
Yeah.
need you to explain that to
Okay.
me.
Let's assume for the moment that you agree that this should not have been built at this level, okay? and you...
Wait a minute. Do we agree?
That the deck height does not meet your zoning ordinance. In other words, Mr. McLaren's...
That's
what
what-
Mr. McLaren's report indicates, that the deck height meets your ordinance.
But he indicated that a year ago, or a year and a half ago, when we approved it.
Yeah. He issued a zoning permit. I don't know that he ever rendered a report. I don't know of any.
Well, he
Okay?
didn't render a report, but the board rendered a decision approving it, based on his information when they came for a permit. Was that not a
The board wouldn't have got involved in the...
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, it was not a variance. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Go
I
ahead.
should have made that more
That
clear.
changes my question. I withdraw the motion.
Okay. Number one, I'm not going to spend much more time on the transcript, but Mr. Clerkin, sorry, I'm going to
Mark, what are you
get your names going here, but...
Two Irish guys.
Yes. But he has testimony that would go to the issue of knew or should have known. That's number one. Number two, he also has testimony as to this transcript, because he in fact listened to the tape, got a copy of the tape, and had those portions transcript that he found relevant. Now, he can either testify to what he listened to, or he can say, this is in fact what I listened to. Now, it may go to the weight because it's not certified, but it certainly doesn't go to the admissibility. There's a difference. You may say, well, how do I know it was every word for word? But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Clerkin is here. He's prepared to testify as to it. He's prepared to testify that this is what was said. We brought it here because we felt that it might refresh the board's memory of what you did back in 2016. We could have just asked you to remember, but that might be much, and I'm not saying that your memories are not good, but...
I do have a question now.
Yeah.
When this permit was issued, that was our ordinance.
Yes.
What you're arguing now is what's there does not follow our ordinance.
Yes.
Our ordinance has changed since that point.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how that changed, and what that changed, what the effect of that change. Okay, I don't think it changed in the regard that, Mr. Cristaldi, in the regard of how it would affect this project. Okay, you may have had changes, but I would submit to you that I'm not so sure. I'm not going to argue with you about it, but I'm not so sure. I'd let my experts. They seem to know this better than I do.
What the statute says is this. NJSA 40:55D-78 permits this board, acting as a zoning board, to, quote, hear and decide appeals where it is alleged by the appellant, who is Mr. Clerkin in this case, that there is an error in any order, requirement, decision, or refusal made by an administrative officer based on or made in the enforcement of the zoning ordinance. That appeal is to be taken within 20 days, and then the cases suggest that the 20 days runs when the appellant knew or should have known. The cases, to me, suggest that the decision being appealed from is from when Mr. McLaren signed off on a zoning permit on or about June 28th, 2018. It's my advice that if this board believes that Mr. Clerkin knew or should have known about that that this appeal should have been filed when this board believes Mr. McClurkin knew or should have known of that June 28th issuance of the zoning permit.
And Mr. Manos, we can't get there without some testimony from him.
I'm okay with that,
Okay.
But I want to focus on that issue only.
I hear you. I disagree,
and
but
it's-
even as to the issue as you've framed it, we can't get there without Mr. McLaren.
I'm okay with that, and
Mr. Clerkin.
we can have him sworn in, and then we'll hear from Mr. McLaren, and then, we'll move toward a motion on that issue.
Okay.
Leo, question.
Sure.
Would you elaborate on that phrase, should have known?
Yes, I'm trying to do it with an example. If a zoning permit's issued, and it's just issued, does that impute knowledge to a neighbor? Maybe not. If they never act on it, how do you know that your neighbor went and got a permit? But now, if there's some evidence that you went and you viewed the plans, you saw the permit, you saw something going up, you were complaining about it, then you might believe that he knew or should have known about it.
Would have had to do that within the 20 days.
He would have had to have appealed within 20 days of when he knew or should have known about it. So, you know, if I go get a permit, a zoning permit for my house, and I go staple it on my neighbor's front door, then they probably should have known about it. If my neighbor, if I do that to Pinky, so yeah, so known or should have known, I don't know how much better I can describe it. It's when this board believes he had knowledge that Mr. McCarnan granted permission for this deck height.
Just as a clarification, Leo, or maybe Roger, or maybe Jimmy Galantino, when was the deck finished?
That was my question. Good question.
That I don't know. Mr. McCarnan and Mr. Goldstein might be a bit better able to tell us.
Or Mr. Galantino?
And he might be able. Well, let's hear from Mr. Clerkin. Just state your name and address, and I'll swear you in.
Joseph Clerkin, 8801 Fulton Avenue, Margate, New Jersey.
Can you swear affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
And are you the co-owner of the property you just mentioned?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm going to take it back to the beginning of time, as Mr. Manos says.
Could you use the
I'm
mic,
sorry.
please?
As Mr. Manos has laid out, why don't you go through the chronology of what happened, and when you realized how high this deck was going to be, and why it was then versus earlier that you would have known of the elevations?
All right, the first I knew the deck was at the height it is was on March 4th. I have a security camera, and the builder has used my security camera through the course of the job to catch theft on his property. I saw the deck, and I saw the first board go up on the deck well above where the piers were. The piers were down at 10 foot, the masonry piers down at 10 foot. All of a sudden on March 4th, the deck board shows up at 13 foot. I emailed the builder. I said, I think you ought to check that. Margate has a deck ordinance on all bayfront properties, and it's been in existence since 2016, that decks can only be 1'8" above the base flood elevation of 9 on the bayfront, making that deck at 10.8. This deck is at 13 foot. He emails me back, I have approval from Margate at this height, and he sends me an email picture of an elevation of the house. It gives me the first floor elevation at 13'4". It gives me the second floor elevation, and it says base flood elevation 9. Based on that, the code would say 1'8" above the 9. There's nothing on any of that plan that says the deck is at 13 foot and is approved at 13 foot. So I called on the 5th, was on a Tuesday, I believe. On the 8th of March, I called Jim Galantino. And I said, Jim, I think there's a problem with the deck being constructed next door. Here's the section of the deck code that says it's 10.67. Mr. Galantino said, no, you're wrong. We use different maps. That doesn't come into play. I said, well, would you do me a favor and read the deck code where it says use the FEMA firm map with the date March or May of 2014. That's in your code, what FEMA map and what elevation to use. He said, I'll read it and I'll call you back. He called me back that afternoon, said, it's not in my purview, that's under zoning. I've passed your information on to Roger. Roger will call you back. I went through the weekend, never heard from Roger. Come Monday, I decided I got to find out what's going on. I called Richard Deeney, who put me in touch with Scott Abbott. Scott Abbott, back and forth on a phone call, said, I'll get together and I'll find out what's going on. That was the 12th, I think. I don't have my dates in front of me. I didn't.
Of March?
Of March.
Okay.
In the meantime, they continued working on the deck. In fact, from the camera and the video, they worked till 7:30 at night to hurry up and finish that deck and get it built. By the time Mr. I wrote to Mr. Deeney again. I called him, he wasn't in. I sent him an email. I said, what's going on with the deck on the 15th? He sent an email to Scott Abbott, said, hey, Scott, we got to get Mr. Clerkin an answer on this. Would you get back to him? On and on it went, it went. Finally, on the 27th, I picked up the phone and I called Mr. Abbott. I said, Mr. Abbott, I haven't heard anything on this deck. The deck's already almost finished. I got an email from him that night with a copy of Mr. McLaurin's report stating that no, the decks can be at 13 foot on the bay, which is against what your written code is. Your written code says, and it spells it out, the decks can be 1'8" above the base flood elevation per the FEMA firm map and a date. And it goes on to say, and any subsequent reissues of that map.
Is that the first time you came
So
to?
that's the first I knew that this deck was ever going to be at 13 foot. I'm not disputing the fact I knew they were building a house next to me. They've been building a house next to me since
But
July.
are you,
of this year.
from what you've said and the timeline you just gave us, you became aware that this deck was 13 on March 5th?
March
2nd?
5th.
March 5th. And when did you file the
Wait a
appeal?
second. You became aware on March 5th
That
what?
the deck was being built at 13 foot.
Correct.
I wasn't aware that the deck was approved at 13 foot until the 27th of March when this letter from Scott Abbott came.
Your
And that's when Scott says the deck is approved at 13 foot.
Your calls and conversations were that they were building the deck in violation. Is that correct? Of the ordinance?
I felt they were.
Okay. And you did not find out that it was the city's position that they were building it within the permissible amount, and that was, that's what they permitted. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Did you,
Well, wait, one more thing quick. This is the email from Pirano to Joe Clerkin, March 5th. We're building it based on the approved plans from the city. So you saw it, you were told it was based on approved plans on March 5th.
No, March 5th, he sent me I
Hey,
have
Joe.
that email.
Hey, Joe, we're building it based on approved plans from the city on March 5th. This is in your,
My packet?
I think it's your packet.
It's the only packet you got.
page 3 of Manos?
No, this is
Oh, no,
page
this is
1.
Mr. Manos's letter to me, which I attached so the board would have an understanding of what was going on.
This-
Mr. Manos did another good job of explaining it as well.
Yeah, this was an email from Pirano to Clerkin on March 5th.
This was Manos' letter to me that I sent you.
Okay.
I have,
Right, and I have the actual email that, I'm going to make all the correspondence I referenced in my letter, the actual correspondence I do have here.
Yeah, that email you're referencing?
Yes.
Yeah. Anthony said, hey, Joe, we're building it per the approved plans from the city. And he sends me this elevation. And the elevation says the first floor is 13.4. It gives me the elevation of the second floor, gives me the elevation of the roof line, does not give me an elevation of the deck.
Isn't the
And
deck
it
4
says
inches?
base flood elevation 9
Hold on.
point.
Wait, the deck is 4 inches below the first floor according to this picture.
well,
Well, that's a picture, but I'm talking elevation,
yeah, if I might,
But you know the elevation of the floor,
right?
and the
But what's
deck
the
is 4
elevation of
inches
the
less
deck?
than that,
If
4
I-
inches less than that.
if I could, we have.
No, go ahead.
Of the deck, architecture of the deck, and it does not have an elevation on it. If I could. That's your question.
No, my question is that it gives the elevation of something that's 4 inches within the elevation of the deck.
But it doesn't give the elevation of the deck, is what I'm saying.
All right, so you're saying that's when you're asking if that's when I first knew?
I'm saying it seems like you knew at that point, yes.
Well, that's when I called Mr. Galantino to find out what the story was. I can't take it hearsay from the builder. Builder could tell me anything.
Right, so you became aware that that was the case, and then you started asking
And
questions.
then I started asking the questions.
Correct.
Okay.
And then I didn't get a determination from the city until the 27th of March.
And then we
That-
acted on it promptly. But I would submit to you that the architectural drawings do not have a deck elevation. So that wouldn't have put them on notice that the elevation was in fact whatever his numbers would be, whether it was exceeding the amount that is, we believe, permitted.
Okay. Mike,
Just one last
you had a
thing,
question?
When was the first time, did you go into Mr. McLaurin's office and review the plans?
I reviewed the subdivision plan.
You didn't review the approved building plan?
No, I looked for the setback. There was a dispute early on. We can go back if we want to
No, we don't
relook
want
at
to do
that.
that, right,
I went in to see Mr. McLaurin on July 17th
right,
to talk about work on my father's house.
right.
During that meeting, I asked him, had there been any permits or subdivisions granted for the property next door, because I heard the owner was going to build. They told me no. I went home, went on my merry way, went back to Philadelphia working. July 26th, they show up and start driving piles. They start driving piles 8 feet off the bulkhead. I went down, I looked at the subdivision. The subdivision said the setback was 20% of the lot depth. Mr. McLaurin and I started an email exchange back and forth, what are the setbacks?
Right, but I get all that, but that doesn't have to do what we're talking about now. So when did you actually, when was the first time, did you ever look at the construction plans? That's my question. Have you ever looked at the construction plans prior to March, whatever?
Just the day I looked at the subdivision plan and what the setback was on the house.
You did look at the construction
was the
plan,
question. Did you look at construction?
I looked at the site plan.
site plan. Okay, but was that the approved construction plan?
I don't know if it was the whole set. The girl was very nice. She brought out a set of plans, said, here are the plans. You can take a look. You can make notes, but you can't take pictures or anything. You can't get copies.
Okay, so that was.
So I wasn't doing a technical review of the plans. I was trying to find out what the bayfront setbacks were, because there was a question,
Right.
is
So
bayfront setback?
when you started questioning the height of the deck, which you're saying was in March?
In March.
Okay, did you look at did you go back and look at the construction plans then, or you didn't?
No, I did not. I was in Philadelphia, and I emailed the builder, and that's when the builder and I exchanged email back and forth, and then Mr. Goldstein sent me an email telling me to stop talking about the deck. And then I reached out to find out from Mr. Galantino what was going on, and that's when I proceeded with Mr. Abbott and Mr. Deeney to try to find out what actually is going on.
Was this part of that email, that picture that doesn't show the elevation of the
Yes.
deck? That was part of that email?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm glad you have it. Mr. Chairman.
I don't have anything else at the moment.
Why don't we
Here's the
let,
first floor elevation. There's the deck.
Well, right, so I don't know where you're, Mr., I don't know what you're talking about when you say, I mean, the first floor elevation is there, and you can see that the deck is, right below it, so I don't understand
We just
what.
don't know how far below.
Huh?
We just don't know how far below it is.
Well, I mean, if you scale it, you're gonna, right?
Right, but if
I'm the
you
builder,
That's
if
so
you
tiny
scale-
scaling it.
Huh? Well,
Right, Mr. Richmond, but if you also go by your Margate deck code, the bayfront decks can only be 1'8" above the base flood elevation, and the base flood elevation is on there at 9. So the deck can only be 10'8".
But it didn't place it on there where it should have, sir. Had it been placed on there, you know what? I'd be embarrassed to be standing here, because it would have been obvious at that point in time. But we know what the base flood elevation is. We know what we believe that the deck height should be at. Put those two together. If it had been on there, then that's why you put numbers there. So we're not here.
Well, to me, the picture states the obvious, but.
Is it the scale? It is the scale.
Yeah, well, that picture's not to
No,
scale, but I'm
but
sure
the
the
map is
construction drawings are to scale.
What we're
Well, why don't we
really
just get
hearing
going?
here, Mike.
Go ahead.
Is that, Mr. Clerkin, you seem to be in the construction business. You seem to know all your codes. Way ahead of the 20 days, you had knowledge of this, is pretty obvious. You could, if you're a construction estimator, you could actually look and see if something's out of place. You also would have let me finish. You also would have the knowledge to know that when you called the building inspector and he said it was approved, that it's an approved plan. And if it wasn't approved and you reported it, he would have stopped construction. You already stated clearly that they worked extra to get the construction done. Well, they're just getting their job done. You had all this knowledge. You could have filed a complaint at any point in that time. You were trying to assume that you were right and getting more clarifications, and you let your time elapse. Now you're asking us, that's like coming down and saying, well, I haven't been at my house for 2 years, but they built a deck, and I'm gonna go and get that changed 2 years later. This is from last July.
Well, I would disagree with that because I was first aware the deck was higher than it's allowed by code on March 4th. I called the building inspector. He said, I don't know, he told me, I didn't know what maps the city goes by, that I should drive down and look at the maps the city use. Margate's deck code is clear and says you follow the FEMA firm map, May 30th, 2014, and any subsequent map. The fact that the building inspector didn't want to take action, passed it on to the zoning officer and didn't take action, then I went to Scott Abbott, and Scott Abbott said, let me get to the bottom of this, and then they gave me the ruling. So the first I was aware that this deck is allowed at 13 foot is March 27th.
And that's where we're taking the appeal from, a determination by the zoning official that the deck is allowed at 13 feet. Well,
Okay.
Mr. Collins, you know, quite honestly, whether the builder says it is or isn't, he can't take an appeal from that. But when the zoning officer says it is or isn't, he can take an appeal from that, per NJSA 40:50-D-78.
But the zoning
And
officer said it
Mr.
was okay
McLaren
when he
gave-
approved it.
Right. He
That's
gave
what
his
I,
opinion
that's
when
what
he
I can't
approved it.
grasp, and I'm trying to grasp from your point.
He didn't say, to the best of our knowledge, he did not say that the deck could be at 13.
He just let it go. He just let it be built
It got
illegally.
I mean,
No, he said it, and he approved it, and it got built, and now you're trying to change it.
well, when we
So
started-
it's from when he actually issued it, which is back in 18.
Mr. Collins, I understand your position. And I respect your position. I understand.
But then the other argument is you have an owner with a beautiful house with a non-conforming deck. He just built a brand-new house, $2.5 million house, and he now has a non-conforming deck.
At the time, it was conforming.
It's not conforming.
It
Stop.
was
That's what
conforming.
we're here to find out, Mr. Collins, whether it was or was not conforming. We would like the right to be heard on whether it was or wasn't. And Mr. Collins, you may ultimately say it is conforming, and we'll appreciate that.
Right, that's fine, but you're already past the appeal time, and you're just gonna take up hours and hours of time for something that's already
I hear you.
passed. It's
I hear you,
done.
Mr. Collins.
If it's a 20-day period, gives you the ability to
Well, let's
appeal.
hear
And he
him.
had knowledge on the 4th
Can we,
of
we've
March.
heard from you, do you have anything, I'd like to hear from Mr. McLaurin's side. Is that okay? Are you done?
I thank you for asking. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Pat doesn't testify as to the 20 days. Okay?
Are we not just interpreting the 20-day with, there's no strictness to that?
Mr. Mo-
So we're not going to,
Oh, I'm sorry.
are we not determining the?
We're still focusing on the 20-day period,
Right.
but Roger, and he's more of a different type of witness here, so I'm going to swear Mr.
Okay.
McLaurin in. And again, Mr. McLaurin, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Yeah, on this issue, we're still focusing on that. He obviously has some background and some knowledge because he had some interactions with the relevant parties.
So where do you want me to start, about the 20-day period? or-
That's all, yep, that's what we're focusing on.
Yeah, what
Anything
happened
you want
was-
to add, or if you think we've covered it, we've covered it.
Well, wait, if,
A chronology or whatever you.
I would like the 20-day period, starting back at the time the plans were approved, and then.
I agree, that's
Takes out
when the
that.
decision was made to permit that whole structure to be built.
Which was what they
Did you look at,
June
and you looked
18th?
at the fact that the deck was 13 feet and approved it at 13 feet based on?
It was
what-
4 inches below the first floor,
Right. Based on,
which was the intent of that ordinance.
could you, Mr. Clerkin says that it should be at 9 foot, 10 foot, whatever he said, and you say 13. What's the?
Well, what
conflict
happened
there?
when, in 2016, when that ordinance was developed, I just became a member here. The intent of that ordinance was to allow a 4-inch step from the finished first floor to the top of the deck. Based on the preliminary firms being the only map being used. The ABFE, they were supposed to supersede the ABFE maps, which came right out after Sandy. We kept the ABFE maps because of CRS. And actually, all along the bayfront, the entire bayfront, ABFE was elevation 12. The preliminary firm in the flood damage prevention ordinance, if you're a BFE of 9, you have a 2-foot freeboard, which brings you to 11, which is less than 12. You had to build to the 12 by ordinance, by FEMA, by NJDEP. So the ABFE maps never went away. It was always either or, and actually every single report I wrote for this board in 4 years references both the BFE and the ABFE. It had to go to the higher of the two.
We had to take the higher, was that for that insurance thing?
It's for CRS, for the community rating system. I mean, look,
So we decided we would go with the highest.
yes, well, the state law requires us to go the highest,
The law requires.
most restrictive.
Okay.
My opinion, the ABFE maps are flawed, they're erroneous, they're incomplete, but we were stuck with them. So when the architect, and again, I want to stress, the intent of that ordinance was a 4-inch step from the first floor to the top of the deck, thinking that the ABFE maps are done, gone. But they weren't. We kept using them over and over and over again. And last May, when that site was being developed, I remember the architect calling me up, and this wasn't the only time I was asked, but he asked me, he goes, well, how high can I build that rear deck? I said, well, you have to go BFE plus 20 inches. He goes, yeah, but I'm subject to the ABFE requirement. So I thought about it, and I go, it makes perfect sense. It's that the intent of the ordinance is to have a 4-inch step down from the deck, first floor to the deck, until we do something about this ABFE map to get rid of it, which we eventually did. So what happened in June, there's actually a plan revision date of 5/22/18 on those plans based on that deck height. So the plans were approved in June of 2018 as submitted, showing that deck 4 inches below the first floor. July came around, and there's 2 subdivisions on Fulton Avenue, one at that one finger, one at the other finger. One was a by right next to Mr. Clerican. The other one was a required variances. I don't know if Eric was involved in that. So Mr. Clerican came to visit me one day and asked about the subdivisions, and I told him no, because the one was pulled. I wasn't even thinking about the by right subdivision. I mean, I was I was ill. I was sick. I was going on vacation. I came back. I missed the first planning board meeting I ever missed because I was that sick. So, Mr. Clerican, there is no malintent to misinform you about the subdivision, never.
However, if I can add,
Well,
September 7th, you sent me an email telling me, and by the way, when you stopped in, there were no construction plans or subdivisions submitted. So 2 months after we had our little disagreement, you sent me an email telling me there was no subdivision.
And again, I was thinking about the other subdivision that was pulled. It was a by right subdivision. It's not on the, but you were aware of it.
But I would question this.
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
I have to question this 4-inch and the intent of the ordinance and the intent of the code. The deck code is
All right,
splitting.
we're going to focus back on the timeline and
I
the
think
20-day issue, and that's, I let Roger get a little background in leading up to his thought process, signing off.
I know
Now we're
Roger-
there.
I've known Roger for a lot of years. You got a little bit off, I think, what we're all here on. If we can focus on the 20-day, or, the timeline
Sure.
for the 20 days.
The decision was made in June of 2018. Simple, cut, and dry. You're trying to fabricate a new 20-day period to suit Mr. Clerican. I don't buy it. I disagree with it. I think it's full of crap.
Could you be clear on that?
Yes.
And anything,
Roger, don't hold back.
I'm not.
and not to put you on the spot, but
Mr. Clerican was argumentative every phone conversation, except the first time he came in, it was actually a pleasant conversation. But after that, it just went downhill.
Well, let's stick to
Right.
the 20 days.
20 days
At-
expired.
as for evidence that he knew or should have known after you signed off on the plans, that the deck was approved at that height?
I believe he saw those plans.
Okay.
to her, please?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Microphone?
we're getting a little bit away.
Microphone?
Sorry. We're getting a little bit away from the issue
I agree.
of the 20 days. So in an attempt to bring us back to the issue at hand, I'd like to read from the leading case, Sitkowski versus Zoning Board of Adjustment, Borough of Lavalette, 238 NJ Super 255. And this pertains to my client because my client had valid building permits at the time, issued by the city, not challenged ever. The building permits themselves have not been challenged. The house is built and the deck is done. The challenge was the administrative officer's decision, which I would submit is probably not the correct way to go. But we're here now and we're dealing with this issue at hand. So from the Sitkowski case, I'm reading verbatim. To permit an interested party to challenge the issuance of a building permit by denominating his appeal as a request for an interpretation would render nugatory the time constraint provided by NJSA 40:55D-72A. The 20-day time limit was clearly designed to insulate the recipient of a building permit or other favorable disposition from the threat of unrestrained future challenge. It was intended to provide a degree of assurance that the recipient could rely on the decision of the administrative officer. That this is so perhaps best evidenced by the action of our legislature. NJSA 4055D-72A changed from 65 days to 20 days, which was the prior limitation period. Since that time, the appeal runs for the date an interesting party knows or should have known of the action of the administrative officer. In that regard, the time that Mr. Clearkin, an expert in the field of construction, as pointed out by Mr. Collins, should have known that these plans were in place would have been June or July of 2018. There is no nonsense that we get to March of 19. It's a red herring. It's a way to shoehorn in what he believes the time should start to run by. He had cameras at his house. He knew the construction was occurring. He was at City Hall. The fact that Scott Abbott was nice enough to render a legal opinion, the fact that Roger was nice enough to respond in an email, that's just good government. That doesn't mean the clock starts again. And at the time Roger signed off on those plans in 2018, 20 days from that date, or even at a later date when Mr. Clearkin was in City Hall or looking at the project through his cameras, is the date the 20 days should have run. We are long gone from that 20 days. It's not March, it's June, July, or August of 18. So I would submit that the board doesn't have the jurisdiction to get into all this nonsense. You know, the saying, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bull. We're being baffled now because we're far afield from the issue. When did Mr. Clearkin know or should have known that the zoning permit was issued by the administrative officer? Summer of 18. The time's over. That's it.
Would you like to summarize, please, and we'll be done?
Yes, I'm going to be brief because we've kicked it around long enough, but I don't even need to summarize. You've all heard it. You understand our position, that we became aware actually where it was. And as you've seen from the plans, there is no elevation on it. You know, to me, they didn't put an elevation on it. How would anybody know other than, you know, scaling it? But that's why you put numbers on plans, so that when people go to, you know, build or construct, or people go to check on it, they'll know. And those plans did not have an elevation.
But they did have a scale on them.
Well, they didn't have a scale on it.
They do have an elevation. They have an elevation on the first floor.
Right.
And
At
it's
the time
cool.
the decision was made by the zoning officer when he approved the plans that you could go 4 inches below the first floor for the deck.
I hear you, Mr. Richmond.
Right.
But looking at those plans, it would not have told, without putting a scale in those plans at this stage, whether going to scale or not.
It's not 3.
I know you disagree. I know you disagree.
Okay.
I'm going to try to get some of the other votes. But, hold on.
Question for Mr. Richmond.
No, you
You
don't.
don't get to ask questions, okay? That we do not, so. I'm
We
gonna-
made it on,
we do not. Well, hold on.
Are we going to have public portion?
I didn't say anything
Okay.
about.
I'm not going to go there because we're on
You
the
heard
20
me say
minutes.
code, I didn't say code.
We're up 20 minutes. Now I'm saying it. We're on the 20 days.
Actually, EB is mentioned in the plans.
Can I ask a question because it may, is there something that, I know we got a little astray from the 20 days. Are you saying that today the ordinance is different than last June? In terms of if I was to build a deck, would I be able to
So,
build the
are we-
same deck?
Is this part of the
Well,
20
we'll,
days?
No.
we'll maybe get there
I don't- if-
on your, if, well,
Yeah, I think what was said is that it either is or isn't the same, and I could short-circuit this pretty quickly if I knew the answer to that question, to be perfectly honest with you, Mr. Mano.
maybe, we'll,
With the discussion
And here is
is
your
the 20
zoning
day
officer.
period.
right now, we're
20
dealing
period's
on
expired.
the 20 days.
No.
Okay. He,
At this point, I think we've talked enough.
Yeah, and what I said is to, Mr. Patterson asked me if we should open up to the public, and I
Oh.
said, on very short leeway, if anyone from the public feels that they have something pertinent as to the 20-day period, they can say it, and if you're going off track, we're gonna have to cut you off. Because that's all we're focusing on, and
So please-
I anticipated getting off track a little bit, but we gotta keep this
Hello,
focused.
gentlemen,
State,
ladies.
stop. State your name, and you'll be sworn in.
All
And
right.
address.
I'm Phil DiBaradino. I recognize some of the members on the board.
Phil, I know.
Some of the older guys.
I know your daughter.
Yes, I
And your
know.
address is not on Mansfield anymore, correct?
That's correct.
Still on Mansfield?
No, he's on the bay.
Pembroke Avenue. I
what's
look
the-
at Mr. Clerkin's home
What,
all the time and ride by it.
where on Pembroke?
Address,
Pardon me?
please.
Address.
505 North Pembroke Avenue.
And you swear, Mr. DiBaradino, you'll swear affirm you tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
I've lived here in Margate since 1964, served on the school board, so I know how much everybody's getting paid here because I got paid the same amount. And I hate long meetings. It's a pain in the you-know-what. And it's a shame that this case came up last. And I'm not sure why, because I know he has been really anxious to talk to you about what happened to his property that's adjacent. Mr. Clerkin's had this home and his family since the 40s, the early 40s. I've been to pig roasts that they've had at their house. Great family. They are more local than I am. If I understand what's really going on here, is he tried the best to work through the system, talking to the zoning officer, talking to the building inspector, and saying, I think there's something wrong here. And he finally got a determination that says, oh, you're wrong, this is what the case is. Now, he understands codes, and I believe he understands the interpretation here. So basically what I see happening here is that a deck got built higher than it was supposed to. I don't know what the reasoning was. Maybe there was a map that was not looked at correctly or used incorrectly or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But what's going to happen in the future is going to be determined by this particular case, because we now have an ordinance that I understand that says we don't want to have decks that are up that high in all of Margate. And this deck is obviously higher than it's supposed to be. And so I think that you gentlemen and ladies should hear this case and understand you've got some other individuals who are experts in this that maybe will learn something. I'm sorry it's so late in the game, but I'd really appreciate it if you could give some consideration to this case.
Thank you. Anyone else? Public portion is closed. All right. So, do we need a motion on?
Yeah, we can do it one or two ways. Does anyone want?
He's telling us.
Yeah, so would anyone like to make a motion denying or barring this appeal as untimely based on your opinion that the applicant knew or should have known?
Can we make it the other way? Can we vote that it is timely and make it more favorable to the?
Typically, you
person,
do
so it's not
typically you do motions in the affirmative. So if someone would, let's do a motion in the affirmative that the application continues and it is not untimely. So if you're voting yes, you're voting that we continue. If you're voting no, you're saying it is untimely. Does everyone understand that? Because I don't want to get confused.
Does everyone understand that? A yes vote means it's timely, a no vote means it's too late. You're okay with that,
That's fine.
Mr. Goldstein?
As long as everybody understands, that
Okay.
you said the no is not timely, just so long.
Got it.
No means it's over the night.
Correct. We'll agree to that comment. I mean, that's what the vote
The
was saying.
motion, please.
Over the night's a different.
Tom
story.
made the motion. Second? Remy?
Tom Collins?
Based upon the information provided by all parties tonight and all this wonderful reading, and basically based upon common sense, I vote no, that this is not timely, that this should have been taken care of months ago, and that we're just kicking a dead horse down the path.
Clem Wozleski?
A lot of testimony. Some of it you could even understand, but not much of it. Just taking it down to more pluses than minuses. I have to go against the motion and vote no, as cloudy as it still is.
Then it's untimely?
Yes.
He voted no.
No. Rich Patterson?
It seems to me, the 20 days starting from when Roger signed it, I can understand why that may not apply. But when the appealer should have known, to me, would be back when things were being questioned sometime after that date, but it seems to me August or September was some correspondence. I believe those were the dates. But even if we did go to, I don't believe March has anything to do with this, but even if we go to March, I look at March 5th, when he's given a drawing, a scaled drawing showing the first floor at 13 feet and the deck right there, that at that point, he should have known. If he was a layman and knew nothing about construction or reading plans, but he's an expert in this field, and if he didn't know at that point, shame on him. So, but I don't even think we should go that far. This was over when he started questioning this project back in 2018. I vote no.
Mike Cristaldi?
I agree with Mr. Patterson. I mean, if you're in the building business and you're looking at a floor elevation of 13 and can't see within 12 inches difference, I think you ought to get out of the building business. I vote no.
Margaret Gubernalty?
I agree with Mr. Patterson as well. I think that there was a clear knowledge of what was going on. I also am looking at Mr. Scott Abbott's letter where it said it was legally issued pursuant to the ordinance in effect, and I vote no, it was untimely.
Craig Palmisano?
Yeah, I have to agree with the city solicitor's assessment of I vote no.
Mike Richmond?
So, this hearing didn't have anything to do at this point with code. It had to do with the 20 days. And I have to agree that if a layman was involved, I could give it a little more leeway, but that wasn't the case. I'm a builder. I know how it goes. I mean, you rely on the zoning officer to make that determinations, and no.
The application does not go any further. The vote is 0-7.
All right.
My next question is, and Roger, if you can help me out. I've known Roger for a long time, so I'll rely a little bit on the ordinance has changed since back when this, and if so, how? And then I may shorten the night.
The flood damage prevention ordinance, where we adopted the new map and was approved by the state in July of 2018, kind of gets us away from the ABFE requirements.
So if this building was to be built today, the deck would be about, or the building and the deck would then therefore be about 2 feet lower? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, the building would still be up high.
Okay.
To comply with ABFE requirements.
Right.
But the deck would refer back to the only BFE we're using now.
Well,
This has really nothing to do with us, right?
no, well, it does, because I can go on with my interpretation.
No, but this is something you can call him in his office. This is
No, no,
not
no,
the board.
I have, here's what I would like, Mr. Manos, and you help me out here. I may very,
One quick thing, if Mr. Clerk, and I know he did talk to me about before about raising the house.
yeah.
And he can raise that house to +3.
But then
All
the-
nonconformities,
But then we have a deck, and that's where in the back.
Pretty high.
When you're in the back of the house and you got something sitting way up above you, obviously. Could I do this, Mr. Manos? And within 20 days, I'll give you an answer before the next meeting, okay? And that is carry the second portion of it. Let me talk to Mr. McLaren, okay? And it may be that I'll withdraw it at that point in time. I don't want to take any more of the board's time for today on my interpretation. I can go on with my experts for another 2 hours tonight, but it may be that, so for, how do they call it, judicial economy? Would that be appropriate?
I don't have a huge issue with that. I mean, right now you have a sort of a hypothetical request for an interpretation. We're not really, as Mr. Goldstein said, giving advisory opinions, but if it's the specific issue, I want an interpretation is how high my deck can be. If I raise my house or if I knock it down and rebuild it.
Yeah.
It's
That's pretty
arguably
specific.
and
It requires a staff committee.
Well, that's why I'm asking, rather than kicking this around and arguing with you, legally, am I entitled to be here? Carry it. It may be that you're not going to see me anymore, at least on this application.
Well, what do we carry? We don't decide these things. That's decided.
Interpretations, you do. We'll go ahead with our interpretation if
He can
we can't.
request an interpretation of the zoning ordinance. Now, it can't be an end around to defeat the 20 days, but we've already determined that Roger's issuance of Robert's zoning permit, he's too late to challenge that,
Okay.
and that's staying, no matter what,
Okay.
from
So
this
we
board.
should let him carry it forward.
Okay.
I don't have a huge problem with that, and like I said, hopefully he can work it out, and
Yeah, I don't.
Go through your homework, do what.
Yeah, otherwise we get into that argument again over the law for longer than we need be, but when it might not be necessary. That's all I'm suggesting to everybody, without any further notice is what I'm asking.
yeah, and we'll carry that, I already forget the date, but it was,
27th.
June
20 what?
20, so we'll carry the interpretation aspect of June 27th, 6:30 PM in this room. 6:30 PM, applicant will not be required to renotice or re-advertise to the extent that's even required on an interpretation. Well, in any event, it's.
I don't know,
it's
so
not-
I always advertise when I, okay?
Thank you.
I do have one question, maybe the board.
I'm also a bit confused, so just so long as I understand that the interpretation has nothing to do with the administrative officer's decision and the fact that the deck is built, a CO has been granted, they're talking about an interpretation for their property only.
As we sit here today, for their property only, if they wanted to raise their house or knock it down and rebuild it, it's my opinion that, I'm in agreement with you. that-
You're free and clear.
That's all I need to hear.
My question for Mr. Goldstein would be, and I don't know if anybody on the board has gone out and looked at this deck. It is surrounded by a 10-foot wall.
That's part of the
My
problem.
solution is if they want to keep the deck at 11 or 13 foot, that they pull all that enclosure back to the setback of the house and have it as a deck, so it's open, that I'm not living in a tunnel now.
Well, then discuss that with your neighbor.
Okay. Right now, we're done with, and I appreciate the
thank you.
care without notice. Thank you. Come on outside.
Is there any public portion tonight?
Anyone here from the public have any other comments regarding anything? Phil, I just have a comment on your comments. You were stating as fact things that were wrong. You were stating this deck was built too high, a mistake was made. That's not true. The deck was built according to code. Just for your information. I wasn't talking to you.
May we have a motion to adjourn?
Turn off.
All in favor? Aye.